Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to the seminar series, Transdisciplinarity in Education and Research for CIVIS, Europe's Civic University. This week, we have a great pleasure of welcoming Ute Schwaibold, and I messed up pronouncing her name.
Perfect.
But she's going to forgive me. We're going to be looking at perceptions of climate change in different places. Uta's going to talk with us for a while, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm a little nervous as to what your time zone is, and I'm hoping it's not a hideous time of day. I actually don't know. Uta, I'm going to also turn my own camera off so we get a really nice recording, but I'm going to be in the background and I'll pop up if anything doesn't work, and I'll always be ready there to answer any of your questions.
Thank you.
Welcome to the seminar series.
Okay.
If you'd like to go ahead and
My
share your
slides.
screen,
Yeah,
I will
that
confirm.
did come up, I'm hoping.
They're already looking great.
Slide one. Yay. Okay, so as Alistair said, my name is Ute Schwaibold. I'm at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And if you read the title of the talk, you would expect me to be a social scientist, but in fact, I'm an environmental scientist. When I moved into or started studying, I picked zoology and environmental sciences because I really didn't like working with people. And the more I worked in the space, the more I moved into the sort of social ecological space where most of what I do requires me dealing with people now. So what I found is that one needs to try and understand why people make decisions that they make, how they think about things, why they think the way they think about certain things. And you start realizing that people's views of the world are very different, depending on where in the world you are. Even within South Africa, where you are, the views of the world are quite different. And when we tackle things like climate change or environmental degradation, you start realizing that the way that we see the world does not necessarily match the way or the lens that other people view the world through. And so it starts pushing us into the space of trying to understand how people perceive that environment that they are in, how they perceive things like climate change, and what drives that perception or what affects that perception. And often it comes down to beliefs as one of the strong aspects that drives those perceptions. So what I want to introduce you to very briefly today is really like a glimpse into this world, is sort of an understanding of perceptions and beliefs around climate change, but from an environmental sciences point of view, not from a social sciences point of view, because we need to deal with these communities in different ways and accepting these beliefs without necessarily interpreting or analyzing them. And so it really is a brief view of how we see this sort of space or this realm. This isn't working. Okay, so we talk about perceptions. Really, what we're talking about is the way that we interpret our experiences of our world. Now, these perceptions are shaped by our interactions with the environment. They're shaped by or influenced by our beliefs, our attitudes, and our expectations. Now, these perceptions also act as a lens through which we understand aspects such as climate change. So, for example, some people might view climate change as part of a natural cycle, others view it as a consequence of human activities, yet others view it as a consequence of spiritual imbalances. And if we start or if we start working on recognizing these differences and understanding how different communities interpret this in different ways, we can actually embrace or find ways that communities can maybe better embrace things like climate adaptation and understand why other communities might be more skeptical. Just a brief overview of sort of perceptions in general. If we look at regional variations in perceptions, we see great variation across the globe. European countries, for example, generally tend to have higher concern about climate change, with countries like France showing more than 80% agreement that climate change, in fact, is a threat. But if we move on to North America, we see that perceptions are very different. They're deeply polarized along political lines. And we see that over 80% of Democrats would recognize climate change as a threat, whereas close to 30% of Republicans might only recognize it as a threat. In Asia, there's quite a bit of variation. Countries like South Korea have high levels of concern, but more developing countries like Indonesia might have lower levels of concern because economic challenges actually take priority over environmental concerns. Africa is quite interesting because, again, immediate socioeconomic issues overshadow climate concerns. However, we experience quite a bit in terms of extreme weather events, especially droughts, which directly affect our socioeconomic situation. So there's definitely growing awareness of a change in climatic conditions. In general, what we find is that in developing regions, climate change is often interpreted through a traditional spiritual lens. Many communities will attribute climate extremes to things like divine will, supernatural forces, or ancestral displeasure. In rural areas with lower levels of education and limited access to scientific information, these beliefs are quite strong. And when we see children coming from these rural areas, going to the city, getting a better education, going through university, we often see that conflict with their parents because they come with better scientific knowledge and they move away from these traditional beliefs, but still are in conflict with their parents who still believe the spiritual sort of power of what's causing this climate change. In contrast, in more developed regions, the focus tends to be more on human-caused climatic change. And again, we see obviously political divides can shape these beliefs. And again, one needs to try and understand what drives these beliefs to find effective climate policies. Even within South Africa, we see similar patterns. People who live in the cities tend to have a more sort of developed regional view of climate change, whereas people that live in the rural areas tend to have more of a developing region view of climate change. Other factors that influence perceptions on climate change include education, gender, age, and political affiliation, which I've already touched on. So in terms of education, it tends to be a trend that higher education levels are linked to greater concern for climate change because education tends to provide better access to scientific information or ability to find information. Gender and age also play important roles, with studies showing that women and younger people tend to be more concerned about climate change. And then, of course, political ideology is another major factor. And it's often, in fact, used in political rallies as an argument either for or against funding, for example, or spending money. Now, as we see, perception is influenced by various factors, but among them, beliefs tend to stand out as one of the strongest forces in shaping how we interpret the world around us. Our beliefs influence our emotions. They shape our past experiences. They guide our expectations. They also determine, to some extent, how we process sensory information. So in many ways, what we believe actually filters what we see, hear, and understand. So climate adaptation, for example, in terms of climate adaptation, a community's traditional spiritual belief will deeply shape how they interpret environmental changes. So it influences, for example, how they feel about climate risk or whether they perceive climate change to be a risk, how they remember past weather events, and what they expect of future events or the future in general. So beliefs generally are the foundation of how we think, and it's put very simplistically, and I'm sure if there are social scientists in the audience, you'll cringe right now, but it's a really simplistic sort of way of describing what the effects of beliefs. They are sort of a state of mind that endures over time. It influences our perceptions of the world, and beliefs basically can support or challenge scientific understanding of climate change. If climate change in some cultures is explained as a natural disaster, your response to that will be very different to if, in your cultural view, climate change is a divine punishment or an ancestral unhappiness, for example. Your feeling of power to change something changes depending on which lens you view climate change through in terms of your beliefs. Now, beliefs come from either a cultural, religious, or spiritual basis, and they tend to explain natural events to either metaphysical or moral frameworks. So if you're looking at a Christian view of climate change, for example, I remember growing up in South Africa, we're strongly religious in our communities. And an El Nino, which happened roughly every 7 years, sort of matched the biblical view of 7 years of drought, 7 years of rain. And so it was a very sort of biblical view of sort of climatic events. And when droughts became more frequent, it was seen as a sort of punishment from God. And that's through a Christian, sort of more Christian lens. And understanding these beliefs, again, shows us how communities interpret climate change and allows it to better address climate change in those contexts. I just want to differentiate very briefly between cultural beliefs and indigenous knowledge, because I know there are sometimes they get confused in some contexts. So cultural beliefs are really quite broad, and they include a whole spectrum of traditions, religious views, moral perspectives, etc. Whereas indigenous knowledge is more practical. It is deeply rooted in environmental observations. However, it is still closely tied to cultural beliefs. Indigenous knowledge is passed down through generations, and it often aligns with what we would perceive as being sustainable environmental practices. So just a few things I just want to touch on before I go into the next slides. It's definitions of various aspects of what drives our behaviors. The one we've touched on, which is beliefs, are basically concepts that we hold to be true based on our values or experiences or social influences. They are deeply held ideas that are shaped by this background. Attitudes are evaluations that are based on beliefs and experiences. So they're basically feelings or sort of predispositions, I guess, you have towards an issue such as climate change. They are influenced, among other things, by beliefs, but also by experience, etc. Knowledge, very simple, is the information that we gain through experience or education. It may support or challenge our beliefs. So it does, to some extent, shape our beliefs and attitudes, and may change our beliefs to some extent if we start getting more knowledge or more information about certain aspects. But it's important to note that knowledge alone doesn't necessarily translate into sort of a positive or change in behavior, because it is still influenced by our beliefs and attitudes. And then behavior, finally, obviously, there's the final action or the outcome, the outward expression of our beliefs and attitudes that are shaped to some extent by knowledge. But again, some people might have very strong pro-environmental beliefs, but they may not act on it because of social pressures or financial limitations. So again, the three being positive doesn't necessarily translate into a positive behavior. Whoops, apologies. So beliefs really play a fundamental role in shaping our attitudes, knowledge, interpretation, and ultimately our behavior. They influence whether we accept scientific knowledge or stick to traditional explanations for environmental changes. So, for example, a belief that an individual action can create meaningful change can actually enhance environmental engagement, while a belief that environmental events are beyond human control may discourage pro-environmental behavior. So what we find, for example, in some of our rural areas that my students have done some research in, if the belief is that droughts are caused by unhappy ancestors moving away from traditions, etc., there will be no positive or pro-environmental behavior, because the problem is not seen to be an environmental one, but a spiritual one. And so again, one can see that strength of beliefs, despite having knowledge coming in from more developed parts of the country in terms of the science around climate change. If one holds onto that belief of spiritual intervention, the activity or the action, the behavior from that point of view will not be one that addresses the actual environmental problem, but it will address a spiritual one. Okay, so if one looks at how communities will interpret this, and I'm going to stick primarily to African communities here because it's a space I'm a bit more comfortable with. So the examples you'll see now are mainly based on sort of African research and African findings. Many African communities, climate change is seen, as we said, as a spiritual or a supernatural event. So extreme weather events such as droughts or floods are interpreted as divine punishment for human misbehavior, for example. In South Africa, we see, and in many other African countries as well, we see a sort of a split view in terms of some communities that hold very strong Christian views will see prolonged dry spells as a punishment from God, whereas from a more traditional point of view, the traditional healers and sangomas would see it as a consequence of neglecting the ancestors by pursuing a more westernized sort of way of life. And so these beliefs really show how this cultural and religious worldview is quite intertwined with the perceptions around climate change. Some of the beliefs around climate change vary quite widely. Some communities will see it, as we said, linked to a disrespect for ancestors, punishment for abandoning traditional practices, or a failure to observe the usual cultural sort of behaviors that are expected from ancestors. In Nigeria, for example, the Yoruba people will see weather patterns being influenced by traditional deities, and sacred sites such as the ones in Zimbabwe that are quite well studied are thought to play a role in, for example, regulating wind and precipitation. And that view will shape how the community will respond to extreme climate events. But even here, we see clear gender and generational differences. Even our research in South Africa has shown that generally older generations see climate change as a spiritual consequence, whereas the younger generations, having access to better education, tend to see it as, for example, a consequence of deforestation, of industrial activity, pollution, etc. And what we see is that clash of generations when they come together to discuss how to deal with the drought, for example. The younger generation will bring a very scientific approach to the table, whereas the older generation will come with a more spiritual approach to solving the problem. Similarly, we see differences in perceptions from different genders. Women are more concerned about the impact of climate change on food security and just keeping a household going, whereas men are more, or tend to be more, concerned about employment and income loss due to climate change. Beliefs around droughts. Drought, again, often seen as a consequence of disrespecting sacred traditions. In Zimbabwe, for example, they have different types of drought that are linked to different types of sort of punishments. You have your early season droughts, mid-season droughts, late season droughts, and they're all linked to different reasons as to why these droughts are happening. One of the sort of interesting approaches to this is often migrating to more sacred ground, high-lying lands, which are also often sacred grounds. And it's assumed that these have more stable climatic conditions, but also appease the ancestors and will improve the conditions. Similarly, floods, also linked to spiritual or natural signs. Indigenous communities will use early warning systems like bird migrations or flowering of specific tree species, etc., as well as spiritual leader predictions to predict floods coming in. Again, the farmers in Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal will practice certain rituals and certain processes in response to these floods as well. And we see, for example, the disturbance of sacred sites is seen in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and some other countries as a disruption to nature, and as punishment, you see the onset of floods. Some indigenous communities in sub-Saharan Africa will believe that climate change is caused again by divine punishment or supernatural forces. So we've covered that already. Climate shifts are seen in Southern Africa as divine punishment, and that is both seen from a Christian and an ancestral perspective. So they're always seen as a form of punishment for something that the community has done or has not done. In Zimbabwe, there are a number of rituals that are seen to, or are expected to restore environmental balance, appease the angry ancestors, and prevent further extreme events. And in the Yoruba communities in Nigeria, we've seen forests and natural habitats are believed to house ancestors and deities, which has historically contributed to their conservation through sacred groves and taboos against deforestation, etc. But again, it's seen that the destruction of these forests is what causes the extreme climate events that we are experiencing. Indigenous communities also have developed intricate systems for predicting climate variability, very similar to some of the sort of, common, superstitions we find in Europe sometimes in terms of weather patterns linked to certain events. In Lesotho, for example, we see that the ways that donkeys would bray, or we see increased bird activity as a prediction of cold weather coming in. Zimbabwe, the Zimbabweans tend to look at cloud formation, wind behavior, and bird migrations that are used to forecast rainfall. And along the Nigerian coastline, coastal communities will observe swallow-tailed kites and their migration patterns to predict floods. And interestingly, often these traditional forecasting methods will align with scientific weather predictions as well. Now, despite the fact that we've been talking about how sort of beliefs, these spiritual or sort of supernatural beliefs around climate change actually drive how these communities will interpret climate change, they do actually acknowledge a link between environmental degradation and climate change. But unlike our scientific view of this, they don't make it, it's not a direct link. So it is more a thought of seeing environmental degradation, or the environmental degradation that is experienced makes the ancestors unhappy, which then causes climate change, rather than it being a direct link. But like I say, in terms of seeing that link in Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa, research has shown that that activities such as deforestation, overuse of resources, etc., actually worsen droughts and land degradation in those areas. But like I say, it's not a direct link. It's seen as an activity that has made ancestors or gods unhappy, which in turn has brought this punishment of drought onto the communities. I mean, indigenous strategies are designed to mitigate climate risks. For example, in West Africa, we see flood recession farming as an activity where people take advantage of the fertile soils that remain after the floods. In Southern Africa, we see a lot of rain petitioning ceremonies or rituals to invoke rain being held. Even in the Christian communities, there is far more attendance at church and praying for rain that we see in the Southern African context. In East Africa, the pastoralists will migrate in response to climate change to relocate livestock based on where water is available. Apologies. So just to sort of summarize this, in rural Africa, the perceptions on climate change are quite strongly influenced by the interplay of beliefs, attitudes, and knowledge, with, again, a very strong push from the beliefs perspective or the beliefs lens. Traditional beliefs tend to attribute climate anomalies to spiritual or cultural causes. And these beliefs, again, shape our attitudes towards climate phenomena, influencing how communities will respond to environmental changes. In some cases, these traditional beliefs might actually hinder the adoption of scientific adaptation strategies. In other cases, it might actually promote more sustainable practices that are rooted in indigenous knowledge. For example, in Kenya, farmers will preserve traditional seed varieties that are resilient to climate variability, despite of economic challenges and legalities around doing this. Knowledge, both indigenous and scientific, will play a crucial role in shaping these attitudes and beliefs. So as I said, it's not that knowledge is disregarded completely. It does to some extent affect beliefs, and we see it in the younger generation. They come into the city to study with their beliefs from their environment or from their communities, and then change those beliefs ever so slightly based on the knowledge that they gain here. And they tend to move more into a scientific approach to climate change rather than this spiritual or traditional approach to climate change. Yeah. Now, what is really sort of tricky to manage is this dynamic interaction between beliefs, attitudes, and knowledge, because one needs to try and understand to what extent beliefs do influence how communities respond to climate action, for example, and how they will respond to address climate change. And it really is quite driven by which lens they view climate change through. So it's quite important, and even for us in the scientific community to note, is that one cannot disregard these beliefs as something. Just because we don't believe it doesn't mean it doesn't hold true for these communities. One does need to respect these beliefs. And it comes back to something Anka was saying, I think 2 or 3 talks ago, is you need to meet the people you're dealing with as a scientist. You need to meet them halfway. And the same applies to these communities. One has to respect and integrate their traditional worldviews into decision making. Their spiritual and cultural beliefs, whether we believe them or not, is irrelevant. They have to be honored and they have to be acknowledged and respected. Similarly, indigenous knowledge systems are essential for sustainable adaptation because many of their sort of practices are in fact good sustainable approaches to climate change. And especially in areas where you have limited infrastructure or more development would need to happen, going back to these traditional ways of doing things and addressing things like droughts, actually quite helpful. Indigenous practices again have to be sort of acknowledged and recognized in climate communication. So for example, in South Africa, there are many indigenous practices that have actually been successfully employed to predict weather patterns and inform agricultural activities. At the same time, they've also been built into sort of sustainable, climate-smart agricultural practices. So it shows respect for the community's beliefs and ways of living, while at the same time addressing climate change. And again, here the key is not to try and convince communities that the scientific view of climate change is the correct one. In this case, one has to accept there is no right and wrong. Allowing them to view climate change through that beliefs lens needs to be acceptable. It's how one addresses dealing with the drought and ensuring the communities survive through those droughts that is really essential, and that's where the beliefs lens has to be respected. Collaborative efforts that honor Indigenous rights and traditional knowledge have also been seen to lead to significant environmental restoration and improvement. One example is, for example, the dismantling of hydroelectric dams on the Klamath River, which is a partnership between Indigenous nations and other stakeholders, but again, respecting that Indigenous approach to dealing with environmental issues has actually been quite successful in making these projects a success. Whoops, jumping the gun again, apologies. And incorporating these traditional ecological views into modern practices has also been seen to be beneficial in managing environmental risks. For example, the use of controlled burns by Indigenous communities who really have a very different understanding of their environment and when burns are needed. Has been quite useful. This knowledge is rooted in ancestral land stewardship. It's been recognized as a method to prevent catastrophic wildfires, and it promotes ecosystem health. And often is far more effective than the sort of the scientific approach we often come with after having overanalyzed a system. This sort of long-term traditional knowledge tends to be far more effective in really managing that system really well. And so, just to close, and in a nutshell, accepting that Indigenous knowledge and traditional beliefs are present and are valuable is quite important. And often, if one really looks closely at Indigenous knowledge specifically, it often aligns with what we would suggest as environmentally sustainable practices anyway. The benefit of using Indigenous knowledge is that it offers time-tested strategies for adaptation. And if one moves away from trying to force communities to view climate change through a scientific lens and allowing them to view it through their sort of spiritual lens, at the end of the day, it shouldn't matter what caused the climate to change. What should matter is how to adapt to it, how to prepare for what is coming. And it doesn't really matter whether you believe it was God's intervention or an unhappy ancestors or whatever it might be. There needs to be some adaptation to this climatic change. And if one then respects that cultural approach or traditional approach to dealing with droughts, floods, heat, etc., you come up with far more sort of effective solutions and happy stakeholders all around, in fact. And so that, in a very brief nutshell, was a sort of environmental scientist view on the issue and how we try to tackle this, despite not being trained and dealing with people effectively. It's sort of our approach to how to tackle the beliefs aspect in terms of climate change.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much for that really, really insightful presentation. That was absolutely outstanding. Thank you for joining us today.